The summer heat in Liberty City pressed down like a weight that refused to lift, the kind of Miami humidity that made everything stick to your skin and turned every breath into work. It was July 15th, 1995, and Carlos Mendez should have been home by now. His wife Maria had been watching the clock since 6:30, the arroz con pollo growing cold on the stove, while their 3 children asked where Papa was. Carlos ran a small auto repair shop on Northwest 62nd Street, the kind of honest business that kept families fed but never made anyone rich. He was supposed to close at 6, be home by 6:30, kiss his kids goodnight by 8. That was the rhythm of their life, as predictable as the afternoon thunderstorms that rolled in from the Everglades. At the 2-minute mark of what would become the most notorious missing person case in Miami-Dade history, Maria Mendez picked up the phone to call her husband's shop. The line rang and rang, echoing in the empty garage where Carlos's tools lay scattered across the concrete floor. A half-finished transmission rebuild waiting on the lift. His 1987 Chevy pickup truck was gone from the parking lot, but his lunchbox sat untouched on his workbench, the sandwich Maria had made him that morning still wrapped in aluminum foil. Carlos Mendez was 42 years old, built like the boxer he'd been in his youth back in Havana before his family fled to Miami when he was 19. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil. His back curved from decades of bending over engine blocks, but his smile could light up any room he entered. Everyone in Liberty City knew Carlos. He fixed their cars for fair prices, extended credit when times were tough, and never turned away a neighbor in need. The idea that someone might want to hurt him seemed impossible to those who knew him best. But Carlos Mendez had secrets, the kind that run deeper than motor oil stains, and stretch back to the chaotic years after his family's arrival in Miami. In 1976, when he was just 22 and desperate to establish himself in a new country, Carlos had gotten involved with a smuggling operation that brought Cuban refugees to American shores. It wasn't drug running or arms dealing, just helping families escape the same oppression that had driven his own parents from their homeland. The work was dangerous, but felt righteous, and Carlos used his mechanical skills to keep the boats running and his growing network of contacts to find safe houses for new arrivals. 5 minutes into the investigation that would consume the next 3 years, Detective Ray Castellanos caught the case. Castellanos was a 20-year veteran of Miami-Dade, a man who'd seen the city transform from sleepy beach town to international hub of vice and violence. He'd worked the cocaine cowboys era, survived the corruption scandals that claimed half his colleagues, and developed an instinct for cases that would spiral beyond anyone's expectations. When he walked into Carlos's auto shop that first night, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, something in his gut told him this wasn't going to be a simple missing person case. The shop was eerily untouched, as if Carlos had simply vanished mid-task. His coffee cup still held cold Café Cubano, and his appointment book showed 3 customers scheduled for the next morning. But Castellanos noticed things others might miss, the way the cash register drawer hung slightly open, empty of the day's earnings, and fresh tire tracks in the alley behind the building that didn't match Carlos's truck. Most telling was what wasn't there. Carlos never went anywhere without his St. Christopher medal, a gift from his mother that he'd worn every day for 20 years. Maria confirmed it wasn't at home. The first break in the case came 3 days later when Carlos's truck was found in a canal off the Tamiami Trail, windows down, partially submerged in the dark water that hides so many of South Florida's secrets. The Miami-Dade Marine Unit pulled it out with their heavy equipment while television news crews filmed from the roadside. Inside, investigators found Carlos's wallet, his work clothes, and most chillingly, his St. Christopher medal wrapped around the rearview mirror as if placed there deliberately. But there was no body, no blood, no signs of struggle. It was as if Carlos Mendez had simply evaporated into the thick summer air. Detective Castellanos spent the following weeks reconstructing Carlos's life, talking to customers, family members, and old friends from the Exile community. What emerged was the portrait of a man trying to escape his past while building something meaningful in the present. Several people mentioned that Carlos had seemed nervous in recent months, looking over his shoulder more often, taking different routes home from work. His brother-in-law Miguel revealed that Carlos had been receiving strange phone calls, conversations in Spanish that ended abruptly when others entered the room. At the 15-minute mark of this unfolding tragedy, the investigation took its first dark turn. Through contacts in the Exile community, Castellanos learned about Carlos's involvement with Los Hermanos del Mar, the Brothers of the Sea, a loose network of Cuban exiles who ran rescue missions in the 1970s and early 1980s. What had started as humanitarian work had gradually evolved into something more complex, with money changing hands, territorial disputes, and connections to other criminal enterprises that thrived in Miami's shadows. The leader of Los Hermanos del Mar was a man named Esteban Vega, known in the community as El Capitan. Vega was everything Carlos wasn't: flashy, violent, completely comfortable with the moral ambiguities of their work. He drove a white Cadillac Eldorado, wore gold chains that caught the Miami sun, and ran his operation out of a seafood restaurant in Little Havana called La Gaviota. By 1985, the refugee runs had largely ended, but El Capitan had found new ways to use his boats and his connections. The Coast Guard suspected him of drug running. The FBI had files linking him to money laundering, and rival Cuban exile groups whispered about contract killings carried out by his crew. Carlos had tried to distance himself from Vega and the brothers after meeting Maria and starting his family. He'd opened his auto shop with money saved from the refugee missions, determined to build an honest life for his children. But in communities bound by blood, history, and shared struggle, walking away is never simple. Vega had let Carlos go, but with conditions. The arrangement was simple. Carlos would keep his mouth shut about their operations, and in return, he could live his quiet life, fixing transmissions and changing oil filters. It was a deal that had held for nearly a decade until something shattered the fragile peace. 23 minutes into the documentary-style investigation that would eventually be told and retold in countless books and documentaries, Maria Mendez sat in her living room on Northwest 17th Avenue, surrounded by family photos and her children's school projects, trying to make sense of her husband's disappearance. She'd known about his past involvement with the brothers. Carlos had been honest about that part of his life when they'd gotten serious. But she'd believed that chapter was closed, that they'd successfully built their American dream on the foundation of honest work and family values. Now, sitting across from Detective Castellanos, she began to understand that some chapters never really close. The revelation came through Carlos's cousin Tony, who worked the night shift at the port of Miami. Tony had been avoiding the police, afraid of getting involved, but his conscience finally won out. He told Castellanos that Carlos had come to see him 2 weeks before his disappearance, agitated in a way Tony had never seen. Carlos explained that someone from the old days had contacted him, demanding information about a boat that had disappeared in 1982. The boat, called La Esperanza, had been carrying more than refugees on its final run. According to Carlos, there had been a significant amount of cash aboard, money meant to fund future rescue operations that had instead vanished along with the vessel. The boat's disappearance had been a mystery for 13 years. Officially, La Esperanza had been lost in a storm somewhere between the Bahamas and the Florida coast. The 12 people aboard, crew members and paying passengers, were presumed drowned. Their bodies never recovered, but Tony revealed that Carlos had helped maintain that boat, knew its capabilities and its crew better than almost anyone. If someone was now asking questions about La Esperanza, it meant they suspected the official story was a lie. And if Carlos knew something about what really happened, his silence had suddenly become very valuable to someone. At the 30-minute mark of this investigation, Detective Castellanos began to understand he was dealing with more than a missing person case. He was looking at the intersection of multiple criminal enterprises, old grudges, and the kind of money that makes people disappear permanently. The timing of Carlos's disappearance, coming just 2 weeks after someone had started asking questions about La Esperanza, couldn't be coincidental. Someone had decided that Carlos knew too much, and that silence could no longer be trusted to hold. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Rosa Fernandez had been cleaning offices in downtown Miami for 15 years, invisible to the powerful men who conducted business around her mop bucket and vacuum cleaner. One of her regular clients was a law firm that handled maritime insurance claims, and she'd overheard enough conversations over the years to understand that some boats that were reported lost had actually been stolen, their cargo distributed among various criminal organizations, while the insurance money provided a convenient cover story. Rosa came forward because she recognized Carlos from the television news coverage. Her brother had been a mechanic at the same shop where Carlos had learned his trade in the early 1980s, and she knew Carlos as a good man who'd helped her family through difficult times. 3 weeks before Carlos disappeared, Rosa had overheard a heated phone conversation at the law firm. A man with a Cuban accent had been demanding information about La Esperanza, threatening to expose what he called the real story, unless certain people were compensated for their years of silence. The lawyer had been trying to calm him down, promising that arrangements could be made, but the caller had been insistent that time had run out. Detective Castellanos began to piece together what had likely happened in 1982. La Esperanza hadn't been lost in a storm. It had been hijacked by members of its own crew, working in coordination with other criminal organizations. The boat's legitimate passengers had been murdered, their bodies weighted down and dropped into the deep waters of the Florida Straits. The cargo, which included not just cash, but also drugs being moved between Caribbean suppliers and Miami distributors, had been divided among the conspirators. The insurance claim for the lost vessel had provided additional profit, and everyone involved had agreed to maintain the fiction that La Esperanza had been claimed by the sea. But 13 years later, someone was no longer satisfied with their original share of the profits. Economic pressures, family obligations, or simple greed had motivated one of the conspirators to demand additional compensation. And Carlos Mendez, because of his intimate knowledge of the boat's mechanical systems and the timing of its final voyage, had become either a valuable witness or a dangerous liability, depending on your perspective. At the 40-minute mark of this increasingly complex investigation, Detective Castellanos made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Instead of pursuing the case through normal channels, which he suspected were compromised by years of corruption and political influence, he began working with federal agents who specialized in organized crime. The FBI had been building cases against several Miami criminal organizations for years, but they'd lacked the kind of insider knowledge that could break open their investigations. Carlos's disappearance might be the key they needed. The federal investigation revealed the true scope of the criminal network that had evolved from the original Brothers of the Sea. What had started as a humanitarian organization had become a sophisticated operation that moved drugs, laundered money, and eliminated threats with ruthless efficiency. Esteban Vega, El Capitan, sat at the center of it all, but he was just one node in a network that stretched from Miami to New York, involving Cuban exiles, Colombian cartels, and corrupt officials at every level of government. The 12 people who had died aboard La Esperanza hadn't been random passengers. Federal investigators discovered that they were members of a rival faction within the Cuban exile community, people who had been planning to expose the brothers' criminal activities to American authorities. Their leader was a man named Rafael Santos, a former Cuban Navy officer who had grown disgusted with how the exile movement had been corrupted by drug money and personal greed. Santos had been gathering evidence, preparing to turn state's evidence in exchange for protection for his family. Instead, he and 11 others had been lured aboard La Esperanza for what they thought was a planning meeting for future refugee missions. The murders had been carefully planned. The boat had been taken far enough from shore that the bodies would never be found, dropped into waters where the Gulf Stream would carry them toward the open Atlantic. The official story of a storm and tragic sinking had been prepared in advance, complete with falsified weather reports and testimony from survivors who had supposedly been rescued by other boats. The insurance claim had been filed within days, and by the time any investigation might have begun, all the physical evidence had been scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. But Carlos Mendez had known the truth. As the mechanic who'd maintained La Esperanza, he'd understood that the boat was mechanically sound and wouldn't have been lost in any storm. He'd recognized the crew members who'd supposedly died as men who were very much alive and spending money they couldn't have earned from legitimate work. For 13 years, Carlos had kept that knowledge to himself, choosing family and legitimate work over the dangerous game of exposing powerful criminals. But someone had decided his silence could no longer be trusted. 55 minutes into this investigation that had consumed 3 years and involved hundreds of law enforcement officers, the truth about Carlos's disappearance finally emerged through the testimony of a man named Joaquin Morales. Morales was a low-level member of the criminal organization who'd been arrested on unrelated charges and decided to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. His story was simple and horrifying in its directness. Carlos had been grabbed outside his auto shop on the evening of July 15, 1995, by 4 men working for Esteban Vega. They'd forced him into a van and driven him to a warehouse in an industrial area near Miami International Airport. There, they'd demanded that Carlos provide a detailed account of everything he knew about La Esperanza and the murders that had taken place aboard her. Carlos had initially refused, but after several hours of interrogation, he'd broken down and told them everything he remembered. The problem was that Carlos's knowledge was more dangerous than his captors had realized. He could identify not just the crew members who'd carried out the murders, but also the corrupt officials who'd helped cover up the crime, the insurance executives who'd processed fraudulent claims, and the money launderers who'd helped distribute the profits. His testimony could have brought down the entire criminal network and sent dozens of people to prison for life. So they'd made a decision that reflected both the cold calculation of professional criminals and the particular brutality of men who'd learned violence in the revolutionary wars of their homeland. Carlos would have to disappear permanently, but his death needed to send a message to anyone else who might be tempted to break their silence. They'd decided to bury him alive. At the 60-minute mark of this tragedy that had started with a missing father and ended with revelations about one of Miami's most brutal criminal conspiracies, Joaquin Morales led federal agents to a construction site in Doral, where Carlos Mendez had been buried in a concrete foundation that was poured the day after his disappearance. The building above his grave was a strip mall that housed a dry cleaner, a Cuban restaurant, and a check cashing service. For 3 years, customers had walked above Carlos's resting place, unknowing participants in the cruel irony of his final location. But Carlos wasn't alone in that concrete tomb. The construction site had been chosen specifically because it was large enough to accommodate multiple burials. Over the course of the following investigation, Federal agents discovered that 11 other people connected to the La Esperanza conspiracy had been buried in the same foundation. Some were members of the original crew who'd demanded larger shares of the profits. Others were witnesses who'd grown unreliable, or law enforcement officers who'd gotten too close to the truth. All had been buried alive in the same methodical way that characterized the organization's approach to eliminating threats. The 12 bodies were discovered in different sections of the foundation, each burial site marked only by small variations in the concrete that were invisible to casual observers, but followed a pattern that the killers could use to locate specific graves if necessary. Federal investigators realized they were dealing with a criminal organization that planned for contingencies, including the possibility that they might need to retrieve bodies or evidence years after burial. The methodical nature of the murders reflected a level of organization and forward thinking that was truly chilling. Detective Ray Castellanos was present when Carlos's body was finally recovered, 3 years and 4 months after Maria Mendez had first reported her husband missing. The concrete had preserved his body well enough for positive identification, and the St. Christopher medal was still around his neck, placed there by his killers as a deliberate signature of their crime. Castellanos had worked hundreds of cases during his career, but he would later say that nothing had prepared him for the moment when they lifted Carlos out of his concrete grave, his face frozen in an expression of terror that spoke to his final moments of consciousness. The federal investigation ultimately resulted in 43 indictments and 37 convictions. Esteban Vega, El Capitan, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 3 corrupt Miami-Dade police officers were convicted of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. 2 insurance executives pleaded guilty to fraud charges. The criminal organization that had operated with impunity for nearly 2 decades was finally dismantled, its assets seized and its members scattered to prisons across the federal system. Maria Mendez attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row with her 3 children, now teenagers who'd grown up without their father. She testified about the man Carlos had been, not the reluctant witness to historical crimes, but the devoted husband and father who'd coached Little League baseball and helped his kids with their homework every night. Her testimony humanized a case that might otherwise have been lost in the complexity of criminal conspiracies and federal jurisdiction disputes. She reminded everyone that behind every crime statistic was a family torn apart by violence they never saw coming. The Mendez children struggled in different ways with their father's absence and the brutal truth of his death. Carlos Jr., the oldest, became obsessed with criminal justice, eventually earning a law degree and becoming a federal prosecutor, specializing in organized crime. His sister, Eleanor, turned to social work, dedicating her career to helping families affected by violence and loss. The youngest, Miguel, named after his uncle, struggled with depression and anger for years before finding peace through his art, creating sculptures and paintings that memorialized victims of violence. Today, 28 years after Carlos Mendez's disappearance, the strip mall in Doral has been demolished and replaced by a memorial garden. Maria, now in her 70s, tends a small plot there where she grows the same flowers that once filled her backyard on Northwest 17th Avenue. The garden includes a plaque that lists the names of all 12 people buried in the foundation, a reminder that even in Miami's sun-soaked landscape of endless reinvention, some stories demand to be remembered. Detective Ray Castellanos retired in 2003 but continued working cold cases as a volunteer consultant until his death in 2019. He never spoke publicly about the emotional toll of the Mendez case, but his family says he visited Carlos's grave every year on the anniversary of his disappearance. In his files found after his death was a letter he'd written but never sent to Maria Mendez, apologizing for not finding her husband in time to save him and promising that Carlos's sacrifice had helped prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. The case became a watershed moment for Miami law enforcement, leading to reforms in how missing person investigations were conducted and creating new protocols for federal cooperation in cases involving organized crime. The Miami-Dade Police Department established a cold case unit that has since solved hundreds of previously unsolvable crimes using techniques pioneered during the Mendez investigation. The case is still studied in law enforcement academies as an example of how corruption and criminal enterprises can hide in plain sight for decades before being exposed by a single act of conscience or greed. Esteban Vega died in federal prison in 2018, taking whatever remaining secrets he possessed to his grave. But investigators believe the Mendez case helped dismantle only one branch of a criminal network that had been operating in Miami since the early days of Cuban exile settlement. Other cases, other disappearances, and other families destroyed by violence remain unsolved. Their stories, waiting for someone with the courage and persistence that Detective Castellanos brought to Carlos's case. The auto shop where Carlos worked is now a Cuban restaurant called Carlos's Place, opened by one of his former customers who wanted to honor his memory. The walls are covered with photographs from the old neighborhood, including several pictures of Carlos working on cars, his smile as bright as his family remembered. Regular customers include many of the law enforcement officers who worked on his case, as well as Maria and her children, who gather there every year on Carlos's birthday to share memories and keep his story alive. In the end, the case of Carlos Mendez and the 12 assassins buried alive became more than just a crime story. It became a mirror, reflecting the complexities of immigrant communities trying to build new lives while carrying the traumas and conflicts of their homeland. It revealed how criminal organizations exploit bonds of culture and history to maintain silence and loyalty, and how ordinary people can become trapped between their desire for safety and their knowledge of terrible truths. The Miami that exists today has been shaped by thousands of stories like Carlos's, tales of people who came seeking freedom and opportunity, but found themselves caught in webs of violence and corruption they never imagined. Some, like Carlos, paid the ultimate price for trying to live honest lives while carrying dangerous knowledge. Others found ways to navigate between competing loyalties and moral compromises, building successful lives while carefully managing what they knew and what they chose to forget. But perhaps the most important legacy of Carlos's story is the reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still arrive for those who are patient and persistent enough to seek it. Maria Mendez never gave up believing her husband would be found, and Detective Castellanos never stopped believing that the truth could be uncovered. Their faith was rewarded not just with answers, but with the knowledge that Carlos's death had helped prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. In a city built on reinvention and the promise of second chances, that may be the most meaningful victory of all.